Hi everyone, welcome back to SwitchUp and to our review, finally, of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom.
Yep, we've been playing this one since launch to get a really good feel for it so that we can bring you this review, and we're very excited to do so. But is it more Tears of the Kingdom or Tears of a Clown? It's a good pun, eh? Well, let's find out.
We aren't going to spoil the story, we're just going to give you the very intro. So, as you'll probably have seen already, you see Link and Zelda making their way through an underground cavern. Something happens that causes Link to lose his arm, and then it's reconstructed for him. And this is what also causes him to lose all of his health and sends you back to square one. An ancient evil returns, and Link and Zelda go missing, and that's where the adventure begins.
So let's move on to gameplay then, and in terms of that gameplay, it is quite similar to its predecessor, Breath of the Wild, in that you are in an open world and you will be needing to explore shrines at certain points in order to gather something that will make you stronger as you go along.
As we'd seen in previews, they've massively expanded almost every aspect of the game. Let's start with the physics-based building. Now, throughout the world, there are dotted small piles of building materials that you can use to construct essentially anything you want, but it's a little more limited than that. You can use what's known as the Ultra Hand to pick up items and then fuse them together. There's an element of those locking together to make this a little easier, and then you can rotate them, flatten them out, and place them back within the world. Now, these are not only used for getting around, so you can create vehicles, but you'll also need this as an essential component to many of the dungeons and those shrines that Glen mentioned.
What I did like about this sequel was that it does give you those powers very early on. Basically, by the time you're done with the tutorial, you have the vast majority of them, whereas in Breath of the Wild it was quite a slow burn, and it's quite nice that once you have those powers, you can start to really get to the meat and bones of things quite quick.
That then also takes me on to the next point, which is about the tutorial aspects of the game. It really does require the player to learn advanced techniques, and it uses those shrines to essentially force the player into developing those. They get more tricky as you go along, and there are times where you're thinking this is impossible to overcome, but by having that level of difficulty, it then allows you to hone your skills, that you'll then be able to do things out in the open world that you previously thought were impossible. Then we've got the world itself. Now, while it initially looked like they just reused the same map, it doesn't feel the same because there's so much more to do within it.
Yeah, and on top of that, of course, you have the premise of the aforementioned disaster at the beginning leading to the world splitting, and you have the sky world, and you also have almost like a cavern system, don't you? Caves underneath the ground, and both play quite an integral part in the whole gameplay aspects.
What's interesting about this is that I honestly feel like at times it's quite a scary game. They play on those primal fears. The fear of the dark is a perfect example. When you're underneath Hyrule, it really is terrifying. You're in this pitch black environment. It's very much moving from light source to light source, and there's a real sense of foreboding about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And also things like in the first game, obviously you could suffer from things like heat and cold, and you had to have the right gear on to counteract that, or the right food. But this time it kind of throws you at these places much earlier than you'd expect, and you have to go to them. It's not like the first game where you ventured in, realised, no, not yet, and left. And whilst you can still cook food at quite an early stage, it does feel that much more difficult because of it, but it does prepare you for what's to come.
Yeah, it uses a similar system that we've seen in previous games, whereby each of those three areas will have a way of unlocking the map further. So there are large towers that you have to go into, activate, and then Link will fly up into the sky and scan the area. This then unlocks the surface as well as the sky level. When you're underneath the ground in the cave system, you'll be lighting these almost large tree lamps that then fill the area with light and unlock a little of that map.
I think it was a good step to change the tower system slightly, whereas in the first game you had to climb the tower to unlock it, similar to like Assassin's Creed, that sort of thing, wasn't it? But it did lead to times where you found a tower before perhaps you had the stamina to do it.
Yeah, and on that note, I think they've moved themselves away from how generic it can feel to just go to a tower and unlock it like Ubisoft. But here, each of the towers will very often have a specific almost quest line that you have to do before you can activate it. There's one in particular where you have to go underground through a cave that's quite far away, build yourself a raft, travel downriver, it falls off a waterfall, and then you have to use the ability to come up through the ground. It's absolutely incredible level design.
It is. And also, I mean, you mentioned one of the powers there. Without giving too much away, those powers and the physics-based nature of them, I found were so much more interesting than the powers you had in that previous game. I really did think that was a huge step up.
One of the biggest takeaways I've had so far is the sheer quantity of things to do within any 100-meter space.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Breath of the Wild was notorious for how open it was, sometimes to a fault. You know, you could go hundreds and hundreds of meters without ever finding anything to do. Here I find there's always something. There's a hidden detail, there's a cave that pops up, there's a little quest line, and that takes us onto side quests. This time around, they've really improved the side quest system. You'll find far more of them. Most towns will have multiple side quests, and I've seen a few quests that aren't even marked. I love this. So there'll be some that you might find on a piece of paper that you could go and then find, you know, the hidden cave they were talking about. And those, what would you say, non-depicted quests can add a lot to the life of the game. It's something we saw in The Witcher 3. There'd be loads of those lying around in books that you may never see, and it makes the whole thing feel more fleshed out.
Yeah, I'd agree. And on top of that, you also have, you know, talking about that, making it feel more lived in. The towns this time feel more populated. The NPCs feel like they have more of a purpose than just standing there waiting for you to eventually turn up and speak to them. And the enemy AI is much improved. They're much more aggressive, you know?
Absolutely. So let's look at combat then. This is one area that I personally feel they could have gone a little further in terms of refinement. It's essentially Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, taking on more of a Souls aspect. It's very much a stamina-based system, and they're elements that we've seen in other games. To mention them again, Ubisoft have used the Assassin's Creed combat system for a while, but it has seen quite a few refinements. Tears of the Kingdom for me doesn't quite refine combat as much as it could do. It feels a little clunky in terms of the way that you circle strafe some enemies. It's not that it's bad, it's just compared to many of the other systems, I do think they could have refined it. And then that takes us obviously on to the controversial topic of weapon durability.
Yeah, so obviously in the first game, weapons broke after a period of time, and this remains in the sequel as well. Now, whether you like this or whether you don't is very much obviously a personal taste, and obviously Nintendo feel it is the way to go. They feel that's the way they wanted to create their game, which is fair enough. For me personally, I just don't think it works. I would be happy with it if they had a slightly longer life, or if there was a way of putting them back together. It's almost like, you know, when you're an adult and you go to a conference or something, they make you sit next to someone you don't know so that you can get to know them, and you're forced to do something like that. I feel like I've chosen a weapon I want to use and I'm happy using it, so let me do it. Do you know what I mean? So for me, it doesn't work. I wish they'd had changed that, but it doesn't take a huge amount away from the game, to be fair.
I'm on the same page for sure. I do feel the durability is a good thing, but I would have liked to have been able to repair the weapons.
Yeah.
I just think some method of repairing, and I thought that's what they'd introduced with fusing, and it would have made a lot of sense to me that that was a mechanic. You know, you could find or build a rare material that you then use to repair weapons. It would just make sense. We also see a return of old school dungeons. Now, I say old school, and you could almost hear the air quotes. They do feel like, if you remember the Divine Beasts from the first game, it's very much a physics-based system again. It uses a lot of its mechanics to try and teach the player.
Yeah.
That takes us then to visuals and performance. Now I'll start with the technical stuff. Performance, you're looking at 30 frames per second. We have seen from the community that just increasing the memory clock can bring that up to a locked out 30, but as it stands, it will have drops down to 20. It seems to use some form of VSync, which stops it from massively fluctuating, but it will take it from 30 to 20 and then back up again when needed.
It uses a very similar visual style to Breath of the Wild, which again I think was a smart choice because that game does look beautiful. I love the almost the way that the characters look cel shaded to some degree, and the pale colour tones that's used throughout the world. I think I would say that this game does seem a bit more vibrant, but then I think that's because the world feels more lived in.
I'd agree. I do genuinely think it's more contrasty than the previous titles. It's one of the things I noticed straight away in the Sky Kingdom, or perhaps that's just the Sky Kingdom and there are certain areas below where they keep the more muted, almost pastel colours.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. You do still have those pastel colours, but I do agree with you. There is certainly a much bigger contrast this time.
All of this is to say that it is an incredible looking Nintendo Switch game. For it to have so much more content and look better than the original, and I think it actually runs slightly better than Breath of the Wild. People forget that there were many towns that it tanked even below 20 frames per second. Visually, it's quite a stunning game.
It is indeed, but not just in terms of the face value visuals, but in terms of that physics system as well and what's going on, you know, under the hood, so to speak. It's incredibly impressive, isn't it?
How do we feel about the sound and audio?
In terms of the audio, in terms of the music, the orchestral score, I think it's fantastic. I think it suits the gameplay very well. I do have a gripe with this section, and I think we share this gripe actually, and that's with regard to voice acting. Now, I have no problem with the voice acting that's in the game. I've always said that I struggle with silent protagonists. Now, Link has been a silent protagonist forever, so I appreciate that and understand that, but it just feels so strangely juxtaposed against everyone else speaking, asking him his opinion sometimes, and clearly having an answer off him that we can't hear. In this day and age, that doesn't work for me anymore.
Yeah, I'm almost along exactly the same lines there. It's not that I mind him being silent. It's just the way it's implemented can feel quite awkward, especially in some of the cutscenes where they directly ask him a question, and then the camera pans to look at his face that's just staring into nothingness, and then they'll say, "Oh, yeah, I agree." It just feels a little strange, and, you know, we don't want to go back to those series where the voice acting is absolutely appalling, but there is a way I think they could still give him a voice of sorts.
Yeah, that was my one gripe in this section, to be honest. And again, it is a very personal one, but I do feel they maybe need to find a happy marriage there between having a voice acting cast and a silent protagonist.
Soundtrack wise, it's exceptional. What I think they do better here for the soundtrack is dynamic and reactive music. So when you go into a dungeon, it will very much change the soundscape to match the environment, and it will change much more frequently than it did in Breath of the Wild.
So in terms of value then, you're looking at £59.99 or your regional equivalent, which is £10 more expensive than the traditional Nintendo Switch first party price. Now, in terms of how we feel about this, to be fair, in terms of production values, the scope of the game, that physics-based system that is pretty much flawless in terms of its implementation, I don't think it's a stretch to say that it's worth £10 more than some of the other first party Nintendo games, but it's just, you know, worth being aware that that is the case.
So that's it then. Tears of the Kingdom manages, in my opinion and Glen's, to live up to the hype that was levelled upon it. And overall, we give it a SwitchUp score of 96%.
A fantastic game, really a very worthy sequel. And it's funny sometimes how a sequel coming out can eclipse a game that you thought was almost flawless when you first played it, you know?
Definitely. Let us know in the comments what you think of this one. Were we fair? We obviously have a few critiques that maybe you haven't heard before or that haven't been levelled in a review. But as with anything, it's not flawless, but it is very, very good.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Don't forget, if you are looking for eShop credit to pick this game up, or any other game for that matter, you can get your eShop cards via our website, switchup.gg. Doing so will earn you SwitchUp tokens that you can then redeem at a later date. And I believe, if it's still the case, you can get double tokens if you pick up this particular game on our website. There's also a link down there to Play Asia if you're looking to import any games. Use the link, use the code stated, and you can get yourself 5% off of your order.
All the links, very topical.
Absolutely, yeah.
For all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers, guys. See ya!